Kia ora koutou katoa. This is the first in a series of short videos explaining the principles of the treaty. So one of my favorite writers, philosophers, Ludwig Wittgenstein, once recorded in a notebook, "We are struggling with language. We are engaged in a struggle with language." And he also wrote that language is a form of life which we inhabit, or which we use to engage with our world. And so it's really important when we get to an issue like treaty principles that we understand what this language means in its context, in its original context, because there's been a lot of heat around this issue lately, but perhaps not so much light. So part of the motivation for this little series is to shed a bit of light on what treaty principles are, how they arose, and what people thought about them at the time. And also, what is the relationship between treaty principles and the historic treaty? So Janine Hayward, Professor Janine Hayward of the University of Otago, provides a great summary of treaty principles, including how they came about in the first place. So the phrase, "the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi," was first included in legislation in 1975. The Treaty of Waitangi Act 1975, which established the Waitangi Tribunal, gave the tribunal the jurisdiction or legal authority to determine whether Crown acts or omissions, policies or practices were inconsistent with the principles of the treaty. The tribunal could then recommend to the Crown actions to compensate for or to remove this prejudice to Māori. However, the 1975 legislation did not define what the principles were. The tribunal, in effect, was authorised to interpret or derive principles from the two language texts of the treaty, Reo Māori and English, which were included in the schedule to the Act. Now, in order to apply the treaty in a context relevant to the Crown and Māori in the present day, the tribunal and the courts and subsequent governments have considered the broad sentiments, intentions, and goals of the treaty and identified its principles on a case-by-case basis. So in a sense, they interpreted the spirit or intent of the treaty compact for modern times. So in 1983, the Waitangi Tribunal said, "The spirit of the treaty transcends the sum total of its component written words and puts literal or narrow interpretations out of place," in the report on the Motunui Waitara claim. It's also the case that the tribunal and courts and government attempted to re-articulate or restate the articles of the treaty. These were called principles, but in effect, they were re-articulating, restating the articles of the treaty, or even Te Tiriti or Waitangi, if you prefer. So in the Lands case, 1987, which was the first authoritative statement of treaty principles by the New Zealand courts, the Court of Appeal articulated principles that included the duty of the Crown and Māori to act reasonably and in good faith, the Crown's duty to actively protect Māori interests, that's an Article 2 duty, and the Crown's right to govern, deriving from Article 1. The court characterised the treaty also as a partnership, famously or infamously, perhaps for some people. And we'll return to this concept of partnership in a later video. After 1975, other legislation included reference to the principles of the treaty, including the Environment Act, the Resource Management Act. But again, this legislation did not try to define the principles. The Waitangi Tribunal, however, developed statements of treaty principles in addressing the cases before it, including in the Ngaitahi Report of 1991, where it made this statement, among others: the cession of Māori by Māori of sovereignty to the Crown was in exchange for the protection by the Crown of Māori rangatiratanga. New Zealand governments also developed statements of principles, including the Fourth Labour Government of 1999. Firstly, the government has the right to govern and make laws, which restated Article 1 of Te Tiriti, the treaty. Article 2, iwi have the right to organise as iwi and under the law to control their resources as their own, a restatement of Article 2, the right of rangatiratanga. 3, all New Zealanders are equal before the law, in Article 3, a restatement. They also added to this 2 other statements that sought to address, I guess, more contemporary or present day contexts. So they said both the government and iwi are obliged to accord each other reasonable cooperation on major issues of common concern. And lastly, the government is responsible for providing effective processes for the resolution of grievances in the expectation that reconciliation can occur. And this was pointing to the treaty settlements process that was about to kick into gear in the 1990s. And on that note of reconciliation, I will end this first video and we'll return next time to discuss the views of Sir Eddie Jury and Hugh Kāwharu on treaty principles in the late 80s, early 1990s. Kia ora tātou.